going on. Remember Dr. Mads Gilbert, who spoke to us about his experiences in Gaza's El-Shifa hospital? Mads Gilbert was banned from returning to Gaza to treat the thousands of Palestinians who were injured during Israel's latest 51-day killing spree. Elaine Bradley is one of the few outsiders who actually got into Gaza. She's the former CEO of Volunteering Ireland and an organizational consultant who has worked with governments, the UN, and the EU. Among her various accomplishments, she co-wrote the Palestinian Center for Human Rights Strategy 2015 to 2017, is a member of the Organizing Committee and International Relations Consultant for the UN Year of International Solidarity with the Palestinian People Conference, drafted the National Disability Conference policy for 9 government ministries of the General Union of People with Disability and TCC Palestine, and has provided her expertise on many other Palestine-related projects. As a PhD candidate at Trinity College in Dublin, Elaine's research topic is incremental genocide, exploring Israel's policy toward the Gaza Strip within the framework of the UN Convention on Genocide. And I can hardly wait till that comes out because we want to read it. So we're very honored to have Elaine, and give her a hand, and Elaine will speak.
So thank you very much for the invitation to speak. Since I've come back from Gaza in February of this year, I've really made it my task to bear witness to what I've seen. I've been working in Gaza on and off since 2012, and sometimes it was important to not have a high profile, because having high profile, as you've already highlighted with Mads Gilbert, is almost a guarantee that you're not going to get back in there. But I think my days there are probably numbered in terms of getting through eras anyway. But what I've seen is so devastating, and it's such a critical time that I really welcome this opportunity. It's important to be able to speak out, and as you rightly noted, very few people have been allowed in to Gaza, including elected representatives, including representatives of the European Parliament, who actually give money to Israel and have trade agreements with Israel as well, but Israel will turn around and stop them having access. The recent UN Commission of Inquiry into crimes in the last offensive was not given access not just to Gaza but to Palestine at all, and they had to conduct their research from a distance. So Israel doesn't want people to see what's happening there. For 51 days last summer, it pitted its state-of-the-art military machine against a people with no formal army, air force or navy. The fourth largest military power on the planet conducted a murderous campaign against 1.8 million people, more than half of them children, living in one of the most densely populated areas on Earth. These people are locked in due to Israel's crippling 8-year siege that's been described by the UN as a continuing collective penalty against the population of Gaza. And under the Geneva Conventions, collective punishment is illegal. Israel's siege of Gaza has led to an estimated 75% of children under 5 suffering from malnutrition, which has resulted in stunted growth and developmental delays. And that's just one outcome of the siege. There are so many on so many levels that are absolutely catastrophic for the people there. The siege has stripped Gaza and its people of capacity, and it's rendered their living conditions intolerable. Variously described as the largest open-air prison in the world and the world's largest concentration camp, Gaza constantly stands on the brink of a public health crisis due to the devastated infrastructure, which has resulted in 4 military offensives, the 4 major military offensives. There was one before Cast-led in 8 years, and also the siege that's been applied. In the days before the launch of the latest offensive, Gaza's hospitals were reporting that they'd all but run out of many essential stocks of medicines and supplies as a result of the siege. And very recently, I had the privilege of listening to Mads Gilbert describe his experiences of being in Shifa during the last offensive. It was absolutely harrowing. He had footage of performing operations, major operations on children without anesthesia because there weren't the medicines needed for the hospitals to function. Even without the pressures of the injuries of the war, they didn't have what it needed, and this was a result of the siege. Operation Protective Edge was the latest chapter of a campaign against Gaza that has been deemed genocidal by world leaders, including Evo Morales, the Bolivian president, and many others besides. There's a group of lawyers who have asked the ICC to investigate whether indeed Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. Operation Protective Edge was the latest chapter of a campaign. I've said that. During Protective Edge, 2,251 Gazans were killed. 1,462 of them civilians, I think that equates with over 70%. 299 were women, and 551 of these were children. Over 11,000 people were injured, 2/3 of them seriously. And of the 3,436 children injured, more than 10% of them will be left with a permanent disability. And this is catastrophic, not just at the personal level, but at the level of families and the societal level as well, for people already suffering dire poverty and living in conditions that are just unspeakable. And of course, this is all man-made. Also, during the last offensive, 142 families lost 3 or more members, and in some cases, multiple generations of the same family were wiped out. I think one of the things that we saw in the last offensive was from very early days was the targeting of civilians and civilian objects. So people's homes, tower blocks where families lived in, extended families. So this is how you had, more than 20 members of the same family being killed. Almost half of Gaza has been laid waste to. There's no sewage treatment, little clean water, electricity for perhaps 4 hours per day. And if there's no electricity, there's no water being pumped. There's no means to generate electricity. 18,000 homes were destroyed, with 80,000 homes damaged and in need of rehabilitation. And these figures are from the UN Investigation of Inquiry, or Commission of Inquiry. At the height of the offensive, 500,000 people were displaced, equating to about 28% of the population. And there are still about 100,000 people displaced and homeless. Of those people, some of them are living in, I suppose they're like prefabricated tin huts. There aren't enough of them to go around, but these are it's like living in a sardine tin. And at the moment, Gaza is experiencing heat up in the mid-30s. They don't have electricity, so they don't have air conditioning. So you can imagine what it's like for the people there at the moment. So during the offensive, I was in the West Bank documenting the process of medical evacuations from Gaza. I was interviewing doctors who'd worked with the injured, and I was meeting with some of the victims who'd been evacuated to hospitals in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. It was absolutely horrific. The injuries were complex due to the tactics and munitions used. About 80% of those killed and injured were civilians. I've said that I think it's somewhere between 70 and 8%. Many were targeted in their own homes or while fleeing. The use of the controversial dime bombs resulted in high levels of amputations, burns, and neurological damage resulting from crushing or shrapnel injuries. The doctors and the medical teams that I was meeting in the West Bank were telling me that when they triaged the patients, they just didn't even know where to begin, because somebody might have limbs in need of urgent amputation, but horrific burns all over their bodies, and maybe head injuries or broken backs and things like that. So it was a nightmare for them, and they really were struggling with the injuries that they saw. I think many of them were very traumatized by the experience as well, but they worked very valiantly. There was very little that could prepare me for the sight of Azra, a 19-year-old mother who had burns and had both her legs blown off. She was in a hospital in the West Bank. She and her husband and their two babies had been fleeing the home after the home was attacked, and they were on the street, and their injuries resulted from a drone strike. And if you know anything about drones, I mean, what we're being told is that, you know, that the drones are sort of precision weaponry, and that they can see people on the ground. I mean, people say that they can tell the time on your watch. So technically, they should be able to tell whether they are targeting a family fleeing or resistance fighters. In this case, they targeted a family, and they killed members of the family. As I said, Azra lost both her legs. Her husband, his injuries resulted in burns and an amputation, and one of her children had to have his foot amputated and also had burns. She is going to need skin grafts for many, many years to come, according to the doctors. The situation as well with regards to amputations for a child apparently is really dreadful, because the children everybody who experiences amputations will need some kind of intervention, and many of those interventions will be prosthesis. And for a child growing up, what that means is to be fitted with a leg or an arm, and it's uncomfortable. It takes a long while to get used to it, but because the child is growing, it's a continuous process for very, very many years. So these people who've suffered as a result of the offensive will continue to suffer for many, many years to come as well. Not only that, we need medical interventions that really aren't available within Gaza, and they will have to leave Gaza, which is a whole different story in itself because of the siege that Israel has inflicted upon it. Very little prepared me as well for the sight of Hala. She was a little girl who was found unconscious in an olive tree outside her home. She had been in a coma for some time, and she'd come out of it, and she was making a very steady recovery, but nobody in the hospital wanted to tell her that her mother and all her siblings were killed. And the injuries that I witnessed in the West Bank were just a drop in the ocean of the suffering of Gaza. And I think Mads Gilbert's presentation, and he actually has a book about it, it's called Night in Gaza as well, documents a lot of what happened there. So at the end of the offensive, I went into Gaza and I saw for myself what Israel had done. And standing in the formerly bustling neighborhoods of Shujaiya, Beit Hanun, Khuza, Jah al-Dik, I witnessed utter devastation that was reminiscent of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Dresden. And that is not an exaggeration. I mean, just swathes of these formerly sort of built-up areas just reduced to rubble, with sort of skeletal structures left standing. Everything reduced to rubble in these areas, including hospitals. There were people with nowhere to go, living in makeshift tents on tops of the piles of the rubble that had been their homes. And the neighborhoods were now populated with sick, hungry, traumatized people in unimaginable numbers. So just to remind you, statistic I gave earlier, more than half of Gaza's population are children. And in the period at the beginning of this year, there was very cold weather. It rained, there was torrential rain, the streets flooded, sewage was in the streets because there's no means to pump sewage. As I said, the sewage plant was destroyed in one of the previous offensives, and because of the siege, Israel has never allowed the materials in to rebuild. When it rains, the streets flood, and as the sewers below the street, the level rises, and of course then you have the streets flooding with sewage. And the conditions were just unbelievable. They were so miserable, and 5 babies died of exposure in a 2-week period. Such sad stories, you know, parents waking up, trying to keep themselves warm, keep their kids warm. In buildings, I mean, you might have seen some of the pictures of buildings where there's really just the floors and the pillars of the flats left standing. And families who had nowhere to go, these 100,000 people homeless, would put blankets over the openings to try and give themselves some privacy and block up the openings whatever they could. But it was very cold in that period. and 5 babies died of exposure. Parents reported waking up just to find their dead child beside them in the bed, and it's just horrendous. And this suffering is all man-made and therefore avoidable. So as Gaza struggles with the latest catastrophe, compounding the effects of the previous offensives from which it's never been allowed to recover, the ongoing and crippling siege instituted in 2007 by Israel continues. It's deemed illegal, as I said, collective punishment under international law, and the UN recognises it as collective punishment. It's now, ironically and quite disgracefully, being administered by the very same UN under the Seri mechanism, with Israel holding ultimate control for what and who enters and leaves Gaza. And let me assure you that there's very little entering or leaving, and very little reconstruction going on as well. So this is 12 months since the last offensive against Gaza, the worst yet, with this cataclysmic result. And you can imagine what 12 months have done to people who are not getting enough food, don't have enough medicines. It is just an absolute horror story. It's a nightmare. And all the while this is going on, we have the West Bank and East Jerusalem, where it's business as usual with the ethnic cleansing of Palestine continuing. Settlements are expanding, the expropriation of land and houses, home demolitions and imprisonment of many people, often without charge. Large numbers of the population, including children, being arrested and held in military custody. And a couple of weeks ago, we saw the nightmare of a settler firebombing a family home and killing a child and horrifically burning the other 3 members. The father died yesterday, I think it was. And Israel has tried to say that this is exceptional. It tried to distance itself from what they're calling Jewish terrorists, and I really take exception to them saying that. These are not Jewish terrorists, these are Israeli terrorists, and the acts of the settlers are not exceptional acts. It's commonplace I know you said that you have somebody there who's recently returned from Palestine. There's just a catalogue of incidents involving the injuring of the Palestinian population of the West Bank and East Jerusalem by both settlers and the IDF. And when the settlers attack, they do usually with the protection of the occupation forces, and in the certain knowledge, or the near certain knowledge, that their crimes will go unpunished. So this isn't, despite how Israel's trying to spin it at the moment, this isn't exceptional. This is very much par for the course. It's just horrified so many people in the West, so I suppose Israel has to take the stance and distance itself from these actions. The history of the occupation has shown that as long as Israel continues to act as a state above the law, it will continue to violate international law, with Palestinian civilians, who are the protected persons of the Geneva Conventions, continuing to pay the price. Impunity for Israel is the result of international collusion, a combination of indifference and political expedience. Indeed, the recommendations of the Goldstone report issued in the wake of Operation Cast Lead, they were never acted on. And according to WikiLeaks, the UN Secretary General himself, Ban Ki-moon, played a direct role in quashing any action at the behest of the US Department of State, Israel's key friend and protector. More recently, Israel lobbied its allies to withdraw support from the International Criminal Court in an attempt to avoid investigations into its crimes in Gaza and the West Bank, thwarting Palestine's bid for justice. It's clear that the institutions responsible for upholding international law and human rights have failed the Palestinian people, and therefore they have failed us all, because if they're not human rights for everyone, they're not human rights at all. If international law isn't for everyone, then it isn't law at all. Western governments have placed diplomatic relationships with the rich and powerful over their responsibility to ensure justice for the vulnerable and the oppressed. So in these times and in these circumstances, it falls upon all of us people of conscience, civil society to act. The tools at our disposal are tools of non-violence that succeeded in bringing down South Africa's apartheid regime. We must boycott, divest from, and sanction Israel until it complies with international law, ends the occupation, and observes the rights of the Palestinian people, including those dispossessed, to return to their homeland. We must insist on an end to Israel's impunity and use all legitimate means at our disposal to ensure that this is the case. Civil society must stand in solidarity and insist on justice for the Palestinian people, because without this, it's only a matter of time before we see another offensive against Gaza. That's all I have to say for now, but I'm looking forward to taking your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, and thank you all of you for coming today. And of course, it's I'm Lucia, and I'm going to pass around a basket, this is literally part of a hat, so I'm passing a hat. And the WHAM Middle East Committee cordially and hopefully invites you to support this work and our efforts in leafleting and printing and bringing you important information from people like Barbara. So if you're able to give a donation today, think of it as an exercise program, because here you are sitting around on a Sunday afternoon, and I think that you should reach up and stretch and then reach into your purse or pocket and bring out cash, and even better, if you need exercise in your hands and wrists, write a check. You can make it out to WHAM, and we do appreciate that support so much. Thank you.
Okay, I think we will start the questioning and answer. Hi, Elaine. Thank you very much. My name is Liza Burr, and I'm also on the Middle East Committee. And I want to thank Don Olson. I don't know if you can see him over there, but he is taping this entire program, and he will be broadcasting it, I believe, on his Northern Sun News Thursday morning coming up. Yeah. So I'm not saying which Thursday. 9 to 10 in the morning. Okay, Sarah, are you going to be fielding questions from out there?
Yeah, but you go ahead and
I'll go and ask 2 or 3?
Yeah, that's
okay. I'll start off with the question of what percentage, if you know, or proportion, roughly even, of Gaza has become rubble? And what rebuilding, if any, has happened? And if not, why not?
Okay, I can't give you the figure. I don't have it in front of me. I think it probably is in the UN report on its the Commission of Inquiry report. But the areas that were really devastated were the areas that border Israel. They tend to be areas of either really high density housing, like Shujaya, or agricultural communities like Khuzah. And both of these are really significant. I mean, what happened in Shujaya is going to go down in history as a great atrocity. There would just be indiscriminate firing into an area where people were living with their families, and the destruction that was wrought there. And it's going to take a very, very long time to rebuild it. I mean, it's been estimated that it's going to take maybe 80 years to rebuild at the rate things are going at the moment. I mean, I'm hearing different figures, but the fact is that aid is not getting in and reconstruction is not happening. The reason for that, I mean, I suppose there's lots of technical reasons, but the international community accepts Israel's line about its right to security and protection. But if we're going to talk about rights, let's talk in terms of realities, and the rights of the Palestinian people and the people of Gaza as Palestinians who are occupied by Israel. Israel is the occupying power. It's not a victim of the Palestinians. It is the occupier, and that is recognized by the UN. And it likes to say quite a lot that it's not the occupier in Gaza, that it left Gaza in 2005, which it dismantled the settlements and it took its troops out. But in reality, Israel still basically controls the airspace, the sea around Gaza. It controls the borders and what comes in and what goes out. So it is still occupying, and that's being acknowledged. So Israel has this narrative about its right to defend itself. And actually, if you look at international law, Israel as an occupier, it's an absurdity. How can you defend yourself against the people that you have jurisdiction over and whose lives you control? In fact, international law says, and this is an unpopular thing for many people to hear, but it says that an occupied people and a colonized people have the right to resist the occupation and colonization by all means available, including armed resistance. So, as I've heard it said, Israel has holds language hostage, and it turns black into white and white into black. And the international community collude with this. So bringing it back to your question about reconstruction, the idea of Israel talks about dual-use goods. So suddenly wood isn't allowed to go into Gaza because it might be used for setting up tunnels. Concrete isn't allowed to go into Gaza because it has its dual purpose and it might have some nefarious use as well. And all these things are, just let me remind you again, the siege of Gaza is illegal. This was deemed illegal a number of years ago, and yet still it's continuing. So the priority has to be to lift the siege. It has to be to end the siege, and for the international community to stop colluding with this nonsense. We have to go back to international law and first principles and human rights law as well, and make sure that the Palestinian people have their rights. Very little reconstruction going on, very little getting in. And for the first time ever in Gaza, when I was there, I saw people with not enough to eat. There's been people, as I mentioned, people suffering from malnutrition. A lot of the malnutrition is to do with poor diet, combination of poor diet and a lack of potable water supply. So in 2012, UNDP said that Gaza would not be a livable place by 2020 due to the conditions in the environment that were deteriorating continuously. Now, since then, there's been 2 further offensives, and the poor water supply with bacteria in it leads to chronic diarrhea amongst many people in the population, and that's really catastrophic for children to have chronic diarrhea because they're not absorbing the nutrients from the food that they're eating. So you can see the whole thing is wrong, and the lifting of the siege has to be a priority.
Absolutely. My next question is, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
What do you think Israel's ultimate strategy or goal regarding Gaza is? Is there a demographic factor? Is Israel trying to eliminate I don't mean by outright killing, but 1.8 million Palestinians as a demographic factor if something like a one-state solution emerges when 2 states prove to be completely impossible, which many people think they have. In other words, is Israel trying to get rid of the Gazan Palestinians and keep the land, or is it trying to get rid of both the land and the people, for example, by turning Gaza over to Egypt, or is something else going on?
I just want to break that down in a few different ways. Like, firstly, to say 80% of the population of Gaza are refugees, and most of them are refugees from what is now the state of Israel. So, during the last number of offensives, Israel's offensives against Gaza, it talks about Hamas using the population of Gaza as human shields. I mean, that hasn't been proven at all. And in fact, the UN report shows that the people using human shields were actually Israel. But they talk about Hamas using Palestinians of Gaza as human shields. But remember, they hold the keys to the prison. They could open the borders. Before or during these offensives, they could let civilians out. I think that's one of the things that distinguishes Gaza from other, places where there's conflict. Is most places you have refugees who can flee. It's not an ideal situation, but you can get up and go. In Gaza, people cannot get up and go. They have nowhere to go. They are literally fish in a barrel when Israel starts bombing. And the munitions it's been using, I mean, it's horrifying to see what they've been doing and what they've been using there. I mean, this is one of the world's leading military superpowers, fourth largest exporter of weaponry in the world. Continuously, I mean, its economy is based on arms, the arms trade. And they lock the people in and they kill them. So why are they doing that? Is it because, as I said, 80% of them are refugees from Israel? What would happen if they opened the border with Erez, say, and let refugees come out of Gaza when there's an offensive? Well, they're not going to do that, are they? They don't want those people. They haven't given refugees from 48 the right to return. Even again, that's a right under international law. They haven't allowed that right. So they're not going to want people from Gaza going back into Israel because they might just, I suppose, wander back and ask for their houses back, ask for their homes back, ask for their land back. So those people have locked in. I've heard, I mean, definitely it's getting harder and harder to access Gaza from Israel. Although at the moment now, under the Sisi government, it's hard to access Gaza from anywhere because the Rafah border is mostly closed as well. But I have heard the theory that Israel doesn't have any designs on the land in Gaza. It's really the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and the people of Gaza are just a nuisance and would like to sort of, for Israel, for Egypt to take Gaza back and to be somehow incorporated. And I've heard that as well. And then to address your question, is that what's going on? I mean, I believe, and I'm researching, as you mentioned at the beginning, I believe that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza under the definition in the UN Convention. Because genocide isn't just killing lots of people. There's a very specific definition. And it's not just direct killing, but it's indirect killing, as in removing the means to living. And already I'm sure you can glean from what I've said to you, no potable water, malnutrition, stunted growth amongst children. I just read today a report that the infant mortality rate is rising for the first time in years in Gaza as well. So add to that other really shocking things like we didn't celebrate. We witnessed the anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki over the last few days. We know that the birth defects arising out of the offensive in Iraq in Basra and Fallujah are resulting in phenomenal rates of birth defect due to the weaponry used, depleted uranium, and white phosphorus, amongst others. And we've seen exactly those munitions used in Gaza in 4 different offensives. We don't know what the legacy of that is going to be, but we can guess based on what we're seeing happening in other places. We're talking about cancers, and we're talking about children born with birth defects at a very high rate. So extrapolate that and bring it into the future, and where does that leave a population? There are numerous reports from respected international organizations about the impacts of Israel's policies in various areas towards Gaza, whether it's to do with the economic warfare, the killing of farmers and fishermen, the rendering inviable the land for agricultural use, the destruction of industry and trade. I mean, the last offensive, they bombed, a dairy that made yogurts when I was living there. They bombed a chicken farm. They've removed the ability for people to sustain themselves, and this is an ongoing thing. So combine that with the siege, combine that with all the other things, and when you aggregate all these different reports, I believe that what we start to see is it's not random, it's systematic, and you can take what you will from that, but I believe it's genocidal, is the policy towards Gaza.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Should I do one more?
Do one more.
Okay. All right, let's see. Are people continuing to die, into the present and, as we speak, due to infrastructural damage from the assault last summer? For example, unexploded ordnance exploding, the destruction of the power plant, other infrastructural disablement.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really hard to quantify. And the reason, the thing about the unexploded ordnance, yes, I mean, we saw that just a few days ago. 4 people were killed in Rafah and 30-something injured when people who were trying to clear the rubble of where their homes stood, when unexploded ordnance exploded and killed them. And that happens when I was there, children, because people are so poor there as well, there's scavenging amongst rubbish and stuff like that, people looking for things they can sell and recycle, children with their hands blown off and things like that because they come across a grenade or something and it explodes. And that happens all the time. I think it's just a part of the aftermath of one of these offences. But also, what you were asking about the... sorry, give me the rest of your question. Unexploded ordnance. Yeah, you were saying about people dying.
Yeah.
The stripping away of capacity. You have to understand, when Israel is telling you that it hit a Hamas target, that could be guys launching rockets, but it could equally be an administrative centre, because they're talking about Hamas were the elected government in Gaza, and that fairly elected, there were international observers, and it's recognised that they were democratically elected. So you've got all the ministries of health, Ministry of Education, these are all considered to be Hamas centres, and as a result become the targets. What that's done is it's stripped away capacity for recording things. Records offices have been destroyed or whatever. And there's very little, I suppose, documentation and data being collected. So I was asking this when I was there in February, because it was so cold, and I was saying, well, how would you know, say we have 100 elderly people die this week, you would imagine, how do we know if it was as a result of the conditions, or maybe 100 people would die at this time of the year in a week every year? They can't gather that kind of data. They don't have the capacity to do that. So it's very, very difficult. But at a personal level, a very good friend of mine, her mother, who happens to be around the same age as me, she got a cold and within about 10 days had died. Because what's happening is people are getting respiratory infections because of the conditions. There were a lot of people in hospital with respiratory ailments when I was there, and a lot of people with coughs, a lot of people very ill, and I'm sure a lot of those people will have died. Can you attribute it directly to the offensive or to the conditions if you have no means to gather the data and the statistics about the numbers? Well, it's very difficult to do that, but I think anecdotally, definitely you could say that people are dying because of the conditions, and people continue to die, and people are dying from their injuries as well.
Thank you.
All right. Anybody have? I'm sure people have questions.
One part of the question, first question, and the second was, what is their ultimate goal besides the genocide against the Palestinian people?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you very well. Could you say just a little bit?
Yeah. she asked, in addition to genocide, what is another goal of is that right? Of
Yes,
Israel's policy?
to take Gaza. I mean,
To
my
take
impression
Gaza.
is they want the land, they want everything, and they're doing everything in their power to have that happen.
There's a very good and very shocking documentary called The Lab by an Israeli journalist called Yotam Feldman. He used to work for Haaretz, and I think it came out last year. And what it shows is that Israel uses Palestine, West Bank, East Jerusalem, and particularly Gaza, as a testing ground for its weapons. That after each of these offensives, Israel has experienced a spike in its weapons sales. They have gone up. And the customers for these weapons are the very same customers, the very same countries that sort of wring their hands and cry crocodile tears and give paltry amounts of money to aid, to sort of act as a sticking plaster. And at the same time, they're buying the weapons that Israel is developing. And in this documentary, they acknowledge they want to see their weapons what they call battle tested. It's an essential part of weapons development. And the documentary shows a lot of people now involved in the arms trade who were former military, generals in the army or whatever, some of them still generals in the army. Weapons development and sales is a really, really big business for Israel. It benefits even from European funding through European framework funding. Companies like Elbit, which is a drone maker, Rafael, Israeli Aerospace, all these companies have received European research and development funding to collaborate on projects with European research institutes. So basically what we're seeing is European money going into Israel for this kind of development that's then sold back. And we're talking a different picture here now because, on the one hand, Israel is a settler colonial project, and what it wants is, Palestine. It wants the land without the people in it. I think particularly, as I said, in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. But it's also a key player in the military-industrial complex. It plays a really key role, linked into the US and into Europe. Receives $3 billion in military aid a year from the US. So, I can't. It's such a huge issue. But I can tell you that I saw evidence, what I believe is evidence, of weapons having been tested. Eyal Weissman, I think it is. He's a forensic architect, I think is what he calls himself. If I got the name right, Eyal Weissman. And he's been looking at Israel's use of weapons in Gaza as well. But we saw buildings that were a multi-story building that was sliced down, like as if you'd taken a hot knife and put it through butter and just sliced it in two. So buildings like that. I took photographs of a water tower that it was as if someone had just taken a knife and cut it the way you might cut a stem of broccoli and it had gone over it. Now, how do you do that with a bomb? So there is a suspicion that Israel has been testing weapons again in Palestine. Some of the doctors I met in the West Bank, they were describing injuries. They said they could not explain these injuries. They'd never seen anything like it. In particular, they were talking about dead bodies that smelt really strangely and were slippy and jelly-like to the touch. People were dead. They didn't know why they died, what it was that had done it. And again, until Israel opens the borders and that the correct experts can get in and conduct the investigations that are necessary to conclusively say, yes, this is what's been happening, it's very, very difficult to prove. You just have people like me, and I'm not an expert in this area, but I can tell you that that very large buildings were targeted in Gaza and civilian infrastructure in the most unusual ways, and you'd wonder what weapon could possibly do this. And it ties in with Joachim Feldman's hypothesis that Israel uses Gaza to test its weapons because the world wants battle-tested weapons.
You mentioned earlier that Israel wasn't particularly interested in the land of Gaza, if I understood you. I understand there's a great natural gas field right off the coast that they are, I think, already trying to make plans to develop jointly with some European countries. Could you comment on that, please?
Could someone repeat that question for me? I just heard the bit about natural gas off the coast, but I didn't hear the question clearly.
That's right. She said you said that Israel wasn't interested in the land, but there is natural gas off the coast, and that Israel is working with other European countries right now to develop those fields. Could you comment on that?
You're absolutely right. Well, it is, isn't it? A lot of that field lies off the coast of Gaza, and it is rightfully belongs to the Palestinian people. And one of the things, Israel's siege of Gaza and this policy, that they shoot fishermen. They've imposed a 3-mile limit off the coast of Gaza, that fishermen who try and go out any further than that will be shot. And quite frequently, fishermen inside that limit get shot as well. Their boats are sunk, and their nets are cut, their boats are confiscated. All these things are happening. But the net result means that no vessel can leave the coast of Gaza and get out. So you can't get access to this. And I do wonder if this is just a smokescreen, this imposition of the 3-mile limit, because all the while Israel is pirating Palestinian resources. And again, it's doing it with the complicity of the international community, because this is, as an occupier, it does not have the right to strip the occupied lands of their resources, but this is essentially what it's doing in Gaza and in the West Bank. In Gaza, in terms of the oil and gas that you're talking about.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is sanctions and boycott, are they considered collective punishment? And we are doing that illegally? Isn't that a collective punishment?
You mean the BDS movement?
I mean, sanctions and boycotts.
You mean
we do sanctions all the time. Isn't that illegal?
Oh, okay. Yeah.
The United States and other countries do too, but isn't that illegal?
She's asking if
punishment.
the use of boycott and sanctions by the U.S., and however many places, Syria, is that also not illegal?
I really don't know. I mean, I know that it had catastrophic effects in the Middle East with the US sanctioning, applying boycott, and they've been boycotting Cuba for a very long time. I mean, I really don't know, because I'm not an international law expert, but what I can tell you is that, that individuals like us boycotting a rogue state and calling for sanctions is a very different. Sanctions are used all over the world as a sort of an extension of diplomacy, and what we're doing is looking for them to be applied in this situation until international law is observed. And one of the things, particularly in the US, is Israel has tried to make BDS illegal, and people pushing it out to criminalize them in Israel. The US has been trying to follow suit as well and clamp down on BDS and talk about calling for BDS. But I would maintain that BDS is legitimate, it's non-violent, and when, as I said, when the institutions responsible for upholding international law and human rights are in dereliction of that duty, then it falls on us as civil society, people of conscience, to step up, and that BDS is the way forward. And, for example, the EU has a preferential trading agreement with Israel. It's not a European country, but they have a preferential trading agreement with the EU and benefit billions from this agreement. Now, the EU, in its own protocols, says that it can only enter into preferential agreements with countries that observe human rights, and yet it's not applying this in the case of Israel. So I think it's up to us as people of conscience to hold our own leaders to account, to pressurize them, and to call for the sanction of Israel. And it's not singling Israel out. I mean, Israel, this is what happens to other countries when they don't observe international law. There is some sanction. And this is why there has to be an end to Israel's impunity, and BDS is a way of bringing that about, I believe.
In this state, we have a BDS campaign, a couple of them going on. A group called Break the Bonds is trying to get the state of Minnesota to divest of Israeli bonds, and have been working for several years. The other is there's been a call by several organizations called by the USPCN to boycott all Coke products. So we're in the process of that. Can you describe what's going on in Ireland in terms of the BDS movement?
There's a huge amount going on here. There's the boycotting, so we're looking for boycotting. Can you hear me okay, by the way?
Yeah, we can.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, the sound is beginning to sort of fade a little bit here. Calling for a boycott of Israel, and a lot of people are taking that on. So boycotting Israel goods at the point of sale, letting the stores know that we don't want Israeli goods in our stores. There's an academic boycott of Israel and a cultural boycott as well. And that's not about boycotting individuals, because we do actually, I belong to several different organizations, and we work with Israeli. One of the groups I'm engaged with is Academics for Palestine, and we're involved. Oh, excuse me, I'll just turn this off. Sorry, I forgot to do that. One of the groups I'm involved with is Academics for Palestine. So we boycott academia where it's state-sponsored, because Israel tries to use academia to really push out its image as a very sort of progressive country, bright and shining, the only democracy in the Middle East, all of these different things. And it uses academics as a way of doing that. So we work with Israeli academics where they are not part of that state machine on individual levels. And actually a lot of the people who are involved in the academic boycott movement are actually, many of them are Israeli and many of them are Jewish as well. So one of the slanders really we get is that it's anti-Semitic. So it's important to highlight that we don't target individuals on the basis that they are Israeli, but what we do is we target them on the basis of what it is they're representing and where they're representing the state or one of its institutions. There's a cultural boycott, which is exactly the same, as in encouraging people cultural workers, artists, not to go to Israel, not to perform there, not to lend their reputation and good name to Israel, and in a way that helps to cover over its crimes. The movement around sanctions, we were working collectively in Europe, really, and looking at things like procurement, where companies are public companies are procuring services from Israeli organizations or from organizations like G4S or Veolia that have had a hand in the occupation or in Israel's crimes. So, for example, G4S was involved in the separation wall. G4S, which is one of the largest companies in the world, G4S oversees many of Israel's prisons, and one of those prisons, there was a man called Jaredat Arafat was killed in one of those prisons a few years back. They administer the prisons on behalf of Israel. So we would look for the boycotting of those companies. We'd look for divestment from those companies. We would lobby public bodies not to procure the services of those companies. And sanctions, we're looking for an end to impunity. We're looking for the rule of law. We're looking for international law to be applied. So we would lobby our politicians and any other relevant people to ensure that Israel doesn't get a free pass. So that might mean, for example, during the last offensive, we had our politicians saying, repeating this zombie-like mantra, well, Israel has a right to defend itself, and challenging that narrative, because Israel doesn't have a right to defend itself. And some of it is really just about educating our policymakers and our leaders, our political leaders, because many of them accept Israel's narrative, which is not a true and honest narrative.
Israel's action in Gaza, I feel, is clearly showing that Israel is a terrorist state. And the United States becomes a terrorist state because we are paying for many of Israel's weapons. Unfortunately, this is largely due to AIPAC, the American Israel Political Action Committee.
Public Affairs Committee.
Which, which sort of strangles U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. I just wondered whether you would have a comment on the idea that Israel and the United States are both terrorist organizations.
Did you hear that?
Could you just give it to me as a synopsis of it? I think I got it.
Oh, yeah, that's to comment on whether the U.S. and Israel are terrorist states.
Okay. Well, I did hear the piece about AIPAC.
Yeah.
I think that the US would not support Israel if it didn't suit the US's own political ends and interests. So I would be very wary of blaming AIPAC for everything. I mean, AIPAC is very definitely a very influential lobby, and I think the lobbying system in America is something I would have great concern around. But, the US has been responsible for killing people in drone strikes all around the Middle East region, in Pakistan as well. So, yeah, I think that I think this is something we should all be exceedingly concerned about. Summary execution without any accountability whatsoever, and you don't get to hear how many people are killed, but we do hear. There's another very good documentary, Dirty Wars, about Afghanistan, and it's quite shocking, the lengths of cover-up where families are killed, targets other than those intended targets are killed, and then the lengths that are gone to cover up these killings. I think it's a concern, the direction that the whole world is taking in terms of militarization and securitization. And we're looking also, if we look at America, the militarization of your policing, I mean, that is really very shocking as well. I think Israel is a terrorist state by definition. I think the US is a terrorist state by definition. It wreaks terror through illegitimate means on civilians in other places. So I would think that as well. I would be wary. This narrative, can very easily move towards anti-Semitism, where people talk about the Jews running the world. deeply anti-Semitic, and we have to avoid that, because when we stand for the rights of people, we stand for the rights of all people, and we stand against racism and including anti-Semitism. So I think we have to be more sophisticated, not by those lines, but yes, I think both are racist. Sorry, not racist states. I think both are terrorist states. I think that AIPAC it's not a Jewish lobby; it's a Zionist lobby, and they are very, very successful. And there's a very strong Zionist lobby in UK and in Europe as well, and they're very, very successful as well. And it's important that we're wide awake to the methods that are used to promote Israel's agenda. But having said that, I do not believe that if Israel's agenda wasn't compatible with the US agenda, then the US would, and when I say the US, I'm not talking about the people of the US, because how can it be the people's agenda or in the people's interest to ship 3 billion of aid to Israel when people in Detroit, don't have water in their taps? I mean, when there are so many people who are so poor in your country, how can it be in the interest of the people to be shipping out this aid? But there are definitely interests at play here, and I think it's important that we're wide awake to that.
We're going to take 2 more questions. It's 6 hours later in Ireland, and so you've been on for a long time. So, and Sophia back here has a question. We'll take 2 more questions, Sophia, and then Liza.
Yeah, okay.
Go ahead.
So you briefly mentioned in your talk that
Shout it out.
occupied people have the right to resist by any means necessary, and that includes armed resistance. I was wondering if you could talk about that under kind of using a framework of international law.
Did you hear that?
No,
She's
no.
asking, you mentioned that occupied people have a legal right to, or a right to resist occupation by any means necessary, including armed resistance, and if you would expound upon that some, is that right? Is that good?
It's part of international law. The right, I'm going to Google it while I'm talking to you so I can give you the reference. Right of occupied people. Sure, this isn't a spectator sport. But just, it's not my opinion, it's a fact. And just to let you know where I'm coming from, I've spent since the early 80s as a peace campaigner. I was very involved in the anti-nuclear movement. I was very involved in the peace movement, and for years would have called myself a pacifist. But looking at the situation in Palestine, why I support the right of the people there to resist the occupation. Let me have a look at the law. Okay. Sorry, I'm trying to Google things. So I've changed my position as well, because I think it is racist. I mean, it's a ploy for big powers like Israel and the US to say these people are terrorists and then go out and bomb them. A lot of the people they're calling terrorists are people in their own countries. How are you a terrorist in your own country? And it's worked very well. This narrative of Palestinians as terrorists has worked very well in Israel's interest. It's allowed it to arm itself and to maintain this armed occupation, and all the while to continue to ethnically cleanse people from the land that it wants, and then to name those people as terrorists and to meet upon them and their families the most horrendous circumstances. I mean, there's 40% of Palestinian men have been in prison. I mean, but just to have a think of that as a statistic, it's horrendous. And as soon as we call people terrorists, then it sort of follows that all sorts of measures are allowed to be taken against them. We have to go back to international law, and the Palestinian people are an occupied people, and they have the right to armed resistance. I can't see this off the top of my head. I'm kind of Googling, but I don't want to be rude to you while I'm doing. But please Google it. Put in UN, put in international law, put a right of occupied people to armed resistance, or to resist occupation, and you'll find it yourselves. And as I said, it's not my subjective view; it's a fact.
Okay. I'm going to sort of glom three things together. My husband and I were across the bridge in late May, and we were in Palestine and Israel, mostly Palestine, but anyway, for late May and early June. And my husband said to the guy that was looking at his passport that he wanted to go to Gaza. And as a result, we almost did not get in. So I just want to underline your point that it's very hard to go there. Okay, I've got two things. One is about accountability. I probably can answer it really quickly. Have there been or are there attempts, serious attempts by the United Nations or any other international body to hold Israel accountable for the deaths in Gaza? That's one. I'm sorry, I'm going to say another one too. The other one is about trauma, especially for children, but of course it applies to anyone. But I'm remembering a study, I guess, that some while ago, before most of these offensives, I think, where half the children had lost the will to live. And, excuse me, wondering if you have an update on that.
Just remind me, what was the first part of the question? The second one is trauma. What was the first one?
Accountability. Serious attempts by the UN or any other international body.
I volunteered the first time I went out there with an organisation called the Palestinian Centre for Human Rights, and there are a number of very good internationally recognised and acclaimed human rights organisations working in Palestine, Palestinian indigenous organisations. PCHR is one of them, Al-Mizan, Al-Haq. A group of them have got together. After Keirstead, they worked very earnestly to put a file together to bring a prosecution, to prosecute people that they considered responsible for war crimes. And they did it under what was called universal jurisdiction, which, as I understand it, and as I've said before, I'm not a legal person, but as I understand it, if I've committed a war crime in one place, I can be picked up another place, and arrested for this crime. So files were sent to the UK because leading Israeli military personnel and leaders, political leaders who had had a hand in the massacre that was Operation Keirstead were travelling there. And a couple of things happened. The first thing that happened was that there was a tip-off. So one military leader got tipped off and didn't get off the plane, stayed on the plane and flew back to Israel because he would have had to have been arrested when he got off. And the belief was it was the British themselves that tipped him off because they didn't want the embarrassment of having to arrest an ally, as it were. And the other thing then is they changed they moved the goalposts, they changed the laws so that they wouldn't have to do this. I see no efforts whatsoever serious efforts to date to hold Israel to account. I'm watching the International Criminal Court, I'm watching what's going to come out of this Commission of Inquiry, but even that, if you read it, there's enough in it to make a very strong case, but even the language in it is disappointing because it tries to depict this narrative of the both sides narrative as if there were an equal playing pitch and there were two equal, protagonists at each other. And really that is not the case. It doesn't show the huge imbalance and power differential in the situation. Having said that, the numbers speak for themselves and they illustrate that. So no, I don't believe there has been a serious attempt to hold Israel to account to date, and that has to change. The second part of your question about trauma, it is absolutely, I could hear you getting upset. Mm-hmm. I do the same. It is unbelievable. Today, friends of mine on Facebook thought they were being bombed, and it turned out I would stay in touch with people in Gaza all the time. there was F-16s going over. They thought bombing had started again, and it wasn't bombing. What happens is the Israelis fly F-16s over at speed, low altitude, and they break the sound barrier. Sounds like they're being bombed, and children all around those people become terrified and terrorized. A child who is 6 years old has lived through 3 major military offensives, and there is not a family who hasn't got some horrendous story to tell you about what's happened to them. And these children have lived through this and have experienced this. You know, it's well documented. There's a lot of organisations working in there with children. I mean, I would say that all children are suffering from trauma. There's none that aren't. You know, by what degree is another matter. But when the sonic booms, you've children wetting their pants. They won't leave their parents' sight. They want to be in the same room as their parents. Just a little anecdote. Some friends of mine I stayed with when I was in Gaza. When I very first went there after the offensive. I stayed in a home. They just have 2 bedrooms, a couple and their 3 sons. And I went to stay for a few nights until I had an apartment. And when it came time for me to leave, they gave me the boys' bedroom, and the boys slept in mattresses on the parents' floor. When it came time for me to leave, one of the boys was imploring me not to go. And I thought it was because he really liked me. At first I was like, oh, that's really nice. He really likes me being here. But then actually when I thought about it, what I realised it was is he gets to sleep in the bedroom with his parents because he doesn't, they told me that he doesn't like it. He's so frightened during the night. There are cases of children who were shell-shocked. And if you've seen images of men from the Second World War suffering shell shock, you know, it is just horrendous to think that this is inflicted on children.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Just one last thing. At the end of that, nonetheless, the Gazans declared victory and also said that they would not accept horrible peace terms. So there is this incredible resistance that goes on. And Mads Gilbert has talked about it too, what physicians are able to do in the hospital with nothing, that the people continue to resist and are resilient. And of course, all this other is true too. But I guess it goes to the spirit of the Palestinians, and in spite of what they've been through, they are such an example to, that's a horrible word, but the inspiration, I guess, to the rest of the world of human spirit or whatever. Do you want to comment on that quickly, leave it on kind of a positive? I don't, maybe that's inappropriate, but...
I think you're absolutely right. And what I would like to say is one of the great injustices, a great injustice to add to all the others, is how badly they're depicted by people who don't know them. The people of Gaza are the most generous people. The people of Palestine are the most generous people. But most of my time has been spent in Gaza. They're incredibly generous people. They're very kind, and really, and when I go there, it's as a visitor, and it's quite embarrassing how people look out for me and take care of me because they see I'm away from my home, and these are people in very straitened circumstances. They don't want to be fighting, or they want to live their lives in a dignified way, and Israel does not allow that to happen. They're not warmongering people. They have very little, and if you've ever seen any of the images, there are some sophisticated people with new cars, but there's a lot of people go around on donkeys and carts as well. There's a huge amount of poverty. It's not a developed country at all by any means. They have nothing to gain by picking fights with Israel. That's not what they're about. They want to live in dignity and in freedom, and they're entitled to. And I think it's to us to stand with them, to realise that, to stop buying into the lies and the deceptions and the criminal murdering of Palestinians and the theft of their land and this occupation that has gone on far too long, and the denial of the right of Palestinians to return to their homeland. These are what, if you look at what Hamas was looking for in its ceasefire negotiations, there was nothing it was asking for that wasn't either A, a right, or B, something that was previously agreed and then reneged upon, like prisoner release. You know, they weren't asking for anything unreasonable. They were asking for their basic rights, and I think we need to stand with them in their call. And actually, you know, it's if we abhor violence and war, you know, then we need to change the circumstances in which it's created, and the rights of the Palestinian people is one way of doing that, standing for the rights of the Palestinian people and standing for them as a matter of urgency, because time is running out. It's, you know, the West Bank is now, you know, a series of Bantustans where people don't have access to their land, and settlement building is continuing despite what the international community says about its illegality and how it wrings its hands and it expresses its displeasure. It does nothing to stop Israel, and it does nothing to punish Israel for its crimes, and we have to change that.
Yeah, I think I did that. Thank you so much. I'll show you once again. Thank you for doing this. Thank you. And see you on the streets, I guess.
I hope so. Good luck with all your work, and
Yes,
it's great
likewise.
to connect with you, and let's stay connected as well.
We will do that. All right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Good night.
Bye. Bye-bye.